today to help in the organizing effort and putting this together. I'm fortunate to have wonderful colleagues and friends that I can call on to come and be a part of initiatives like this. And so before introducing them, I just want to say that it's an honor and it's a pleasure and it's a privilege, and I really appreciate it. So we have some heavy hitters in the room, all right? Even though this is, we're not a packed auditorium of hundreds of people, I just don't want to minimize the importance and the power of the panel that sits before you, all right? So let me just introduce them and move forward. All right, so today, first, to my right, we have Dr. Jessica Millward, who is the Inclusive Excellence Black Thriving Term Chair at the University of California at Irvine, where she is an associate professor in the Department of History and core faculty member of African American Studies. An expert on slavery, freedom, and black women in early America, Dr. Millward's first book, Finding Charity Folk, Enslaved and Free Black Women in Maryland, was published as part of the Race in the Atlantic World Series, Athens University of Georgia Press in 2015. An award-winning scholar, she has published in the Journal of African American History, Journal of Women's History, Frontiers, Souls, Palimpsest, and the Women's History Review, as well as op-eds in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Feminist Wire, and theconversation.com. Millward is currently working on 2 book-length projects. The first discusses African American women's experience with sexual assault and intimate partner violence in the late 19th century. The second focuses on African American women and the slave dungeons of Ghana. Millward is also a media-savvy historian who specializes in bringing a historical perspective to modern times. She is currently at work on 2 public-facing digital projects. Along with Casey Callahan and Mike Spears, Millward is a co-founder of the podcast Historians on Housewives. This podcast examines the long-running Bravo franchise through the lens of historical scholarship and has a forthcoming edited volume focusing on prominent scholars who share an interest and analysis of reality TV. All right, lots I could share. I'm gonna stop it there, but just also say that I am privileged to say that not only is Professor Millward a phenomenal scholar and human being, but she happens to also be a friend. And we worked together at the University of Illinois many years ago in Champaign, Illinois, and so it's always an honor to have her expertise in the room, right? All right, moving on. Next, we have none other than Dr. Scott Brown, who is a leading scholar of African American history, popular culture, and music. He teaches African American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and is the author of Fighting for Us, Maulana Karenga, the US Organization, and Black Cultural Nationalism, and contributing author, editor of Discourse on Africana Studies, James Turner, and the Paradigm of Knowledge. Dr. Brown's writings have also appeared in liner notes, Issues in African American Music, Journal of Black Studies, Black Scholar, Freedom North, Malcolm X, a historical reader, Journal of African American History, Black Los Angeles, American Studies Journal, Africana Methodology, Langston Hughes Review, the Dayton Anthology, and on and on and on. Beyond academia, he has contributed to articles in major media outlets such as the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Ebony Magazine, EUR Web, Fresh Hip Hop and R&B, the Hype Magazine, Oprah Magazine, and USA Today. Dr. Brown's experience as an independent musician, producer, and songwriter, he's a mean bass player, deeply informs his research. His original contributions are featured on most digital music platforms. Brown is also completing a book project examining the 1970s R&B and funk bands, and has interviewed a myriad of legendary groups, including, and you gotta put your hands together for the Ohio Players, all right? Bootsy's Rubber Band, all right? Zap, Heat Wave, Slave, Lakeside, Sun, the Isley Brothers, Fazo, Shadow, the Daz Band, Midnight Star, Parliament Funkadelic, Cameo, Platypus, and Entombed, The Time, Aura, Dayton, Steve Arrington's Hall of Fame, and many, many others. All right? I'm going to stop it there, but let me just say this too. Dr. Brown has frequently appeared on TV One. If you've ever seen the show Unsung, he's been a frequent commentator there, and he's been on television, radio, on and on and on. So again, like I said, we got some heavy hitters in the room. Can we get a round of applause? Okay, so we're family here. We want to keep it solid and scholarly, interesting and invigorating and transformative, but we also want to keep it real, all right? And keeping it real is, we want to collapse whatever boundaries exist between you all and us, all right, and have a conversation, right? So in light of what is to be coming June 19th, June 19th, of course, is Juneteenth. It's also a special day because it's my mother's birthday. All right, my mother's that Gemini energy for June 19th. So it's always been significant for me historically. But of course, we know that that's the day in 1865 they arrived in Galveston and announced and let the formerly enslaved Africans know that, hey, freedom is here and has been here. And it has become a period in which we celebrate the Jubilee, right? It's the moment in which we begin to also think critically and talk about freedom, right? What is freedom? Freedom is something that is a constant struggle, something that we are constantly grappling with. We are working to expand, right? We're having deep conversation about. Of course, you all were fortunate yesterday to watch a phenomenal documentary that examines or attempts to reflect on where we are as a nation. Where are we as a nation when it comes to thinking about race, when it comes to thinking about class and gender, when it comes to thinking about anti-Black racism, when it comes to thinking about economic exploitation, social and political justice? What does that mean today in 2023 in light of living through and coming through so much terror, so much death, so much disease and destruction? How do we begin to think through and grapple with this world that we find ourselves in at this particular historical moment? Oftentimes, when we think about history, it's presented to us in a liberal form as if history is always about progress and as if history is linear. But if we know anything about the African American experience, the experience of people of color in the so-called New World, we know that history is never linear, that history does not always result in progress, that history is full of backlash, that history is full of recursive problems and challenges. And so how do we deal with that, all right? How do we grapple and deal? We can't solve it all today, but at least we can begin a conversation that I think can enrich what we do here at PCC and bring us another approach and lean on some of our experts, their insight and their knowledge. Right? So this is going to be a conversational exchange. If you do feel moved at any point while we're talking and engaging, if you feel like, hey, you know what, I got to say this, or I want to say something, feel free to raise your hand. We want to incorporate you into the conversation. We don't have to just save it to the end. All right? So let's also think on our feet and be courageous and engaged, so forth. All right? So let me begin. All right, let me begin. Let me get off my horse here. Y'all see I have my coffee this morning. You know what I mean? When I have my coffee. I just came out of teaching this class. So students were like, man, you were really moving today. I was like, well, I got something else later. All right, so let's begin. Let's think about this. I want to ask both of you, as scholars of African American history, and Jessica, I'm going to start with you, someone who focuses on the 19th century, someone who has been deeply immersed in the study of enslavement, someone who also resides part-time in Ghana, and who is also paid a particular attention to gender when it comes to thinking about Black women's experience with slavery. Can you just sort of talk to us a bit about that history in relationship to Juneteenth and in relationship to the documentary, who we are, or who are we?
I can do all of them.
All right, let's go.
First of all, welcome back to the United States.
Oh, thank you.
You've been missed.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I also want to be clear that I understand what props we're using. Professor Brown, are you going to stay with this mic, or are you going to go to the handheld?
Yes.
Okay, I enjoy the handheld, but I see this is your moment, so I'll stay with this. You asked a big question, but don't worry, I'm ready for it. Freedom. You're asking me about freedom? I know more about what freedom isn't than what it is. That's a paraphrase, right, from Assata Shakur. The two of you probably know the speech it came from. I was introduced to it on the song by Common. But I often think about that. Many times people want to look at this present moment and reflect back into when we weren't free. One of the things I do is I actually start in a different moment when there was a moment that we could be free, and then track what happened. So in the documentary, he speaks about 1619, when 20-odd Africans descended from the ship on the shores of Virginia. Now, he called them immediately enslaved people. Actually, those individuals were on a Dutch man-of-war ship, and their status wasn't defined. But we know by the time, in the course of their lifetime, slavery became permanent and inheritable in what becomes the United States. Often what is missing from that story is the story of Angela. There was a woman named Angela. We don't know where she was from. We don't know, again, what she was supposed to be doing on that ship. I mean, we can imagine. We can imagine that they knew that their fate was going to be different from what they ever knew. So we have Angela, and then we have another black woman named Mary Johnson. And Mary Johnson was married to Antonio Johnson later in the 17th century, and they have a piece of property. These are free black people who have a piece of property, and they name it Angola after where Tony was from. There was this moment in United States history when slavery and freedom did not have to be joined together, or more importantly, where the black experience did not have to be linked to enslavement. But laws quickly developed, circumventing and closing in on black freedom, and it did so at the side of the black woman's body. So I'm gonna say this quickly how it relates to the film. 1662, the law that the status of the child follows that of the mother. That makes slavery permanent, inheritable. That law was put in place, it said on the film last night, because slave owners were raping black women. Yes, that is true. But that statement also leaves out, when we look at 1662, is the black people, African descended people, had the knowledge of freedom. They had an intellectual history they also came with to the United States. They knew what freedom was. They definitely knew by this point what slavery was, and they knew that they did not want a part of it. So we get the 1662 law because black people are responding back. They're finding ways, they're trying to find loopholes out of permanent slavery. And because whiteness was in close proximity to freedom, lawmakers said, aha, we're never gonna control the colonizers from doing what they're doing, but what we can do is make sure that any person who was black will be enslaved. It then becomes a law in Maryland that if anyone, so 1662, by 1664, Maryland says anyone who sleeps with a black person, period, is a slave for life. Okay, that never really happened to the colonizers, but that law was quickly revoked. So I use these two examples to show you a moment where slavery didn't have to be. And I think that often is in the background when we think about resistance, when we think about the Stonewall Rebellion, when we think about the black freedom struggle. There's always this moment that laws develop because black people are doing something, right? Let's talk about Juneteenth as a national holiday. Look what had to happen to make Juneteenth a national holiday. I'm gonna cede the mic at this point and turn it back to Doc Brown.
I was enjoying listening.
Well, I realize we all three of us can talk a lot.
Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate that. Let's pivot and let's sort of continue that. Dr. Brown, who's always in high demand, is going to be getting on a plane later tomorrow and headed to Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. I actually just left Philadelphia. I was there this weekend. I have two nephews, identical twins, Che and Marley, who finished high school. So I was just in Philly over the weekend. But Dr. Brown will be headed there to give a talk at the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Library company.
The Library Company in Philadelphia. And he will be speaking on Juneteenth. And I'm just wondering if you have some really interesting ideas and perspectives on sort of what Juneteenth represents, what opportunity it provides. I'm wondering if you could sort of build on what Dr. Millward mentioned and talk about in terms of where you're going to be going.
Oh, sure. First of all, thank you so much, Fanon and Professor Boland, for putting this together. This is really a real treat to be able to sit down and dialogue on something I think that is very important for this moment. I think it's no accident that as you see a period of time in which much more overt racism has come to the surface, that some of the tools of resistance that people who are oppressed use, such as the battle over calendar space and positioning opportunities to tell the truth. Now, telling the truth might sound like something that's not very radical, but it is extremely radical. It can get you killed. And if you were interested in telling the truth about enslavement in the early part of the 20th century, you had to go up against the very first motion picture on the big screen, called The Birth of a Nation, aimed at suppressing the telling of truth about one of the foundation points in the economic and social system of this country, that system of enslavement. That system also equally egregious, if not more so, the dispossession of Native American land and Native Americans off their land, and warfare practices against Native Americans that would end up destroying entire nations. So all of that is a part of the story. So it wouldn't seem very radical to be able to talk about it. However, Birth of a Nation, 1913 or so. Let's go now to 2023. We're telling the truth again. Is not something that can receive legal support in certain places, whether it be in school, whether it be in certain books. They have to be banned. So this issue of telling the truth. Now, why do I tie that to Juneteenth? The essence of Juneteenth is the opportunity to think about what freedom means, even in the story itself. So many of us were told that President Lincoln freed the slaves, right? With what? What historic document did he write that, or utterance freed us? What's the magic word? 2 words. Emancipation Proclamation. Let's take emancipation out of it. Proclamation. I can just proclaim y'all free, and you will be free. Wow, was it that easy? The story of Juneteenth complicates that narrative, because actually freedom and freedom from enslavement was not granted by the utterance of a word. It was fought over. And so when the Union was at war with the Confederacy, that proclamation was very inspiring, especially to Africans who were enslaved that wanted to rise up. Paul Laurence Dunbar's father, Paul Laurence Dunbar, the great writer, his father had escaped Kentucky and gone to Canada. You know how Malcolm X said, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you south. Well, he was free, he was up there, but when he had the opportunity to take up arms and fight alongside the army to destroy this evil system, he came back and put his life on the line. And so many of the troops that would arrive in areas that were under the jurisdiction of the Confederacy, many of them were black. Those federal troops had the muscle to enforce that proclamation. And they didn't get to every city and every place at the same time. So part of the narrative that I think can be misdirecting about Juneteenth is to say, oh, they didn't know they were free. I'll tell you what they did know. They knew that a proclamation alone was not what freedom is. So while they're in parts of Texas, it's the arrival of the force to make that proclamation real, to destroy those Confederate holdouts in Texas. That's why the date is not lined up with the issuance of the proclamation. Am I going too fast? Are y'all following me? I'm rapping. I'm freestyling. Is that okay? All right. So as a result, what is, I think, the core of the holiday? Unlike the official narrative that says a proclamation or a bill passed or Supreme Court ruling, that's the moment that freedom comes. It delivers the power of granting freedom to the rulers, not to the people. But it was the people that rose up during the Civil War and overturned and defeated the Confederacy. In fact, historians have looked at the political utility of the Emancipation Proclamation and said it was as much a military tactic to get the resistance and the strength of so many enslaved people to overturn the system. So that was the revolution for that generation, which could bring together somebody like Paul Laurence Dunbar's father, not a famous person, right alongside Frederick Douglass, right alongside Harriet Tubman. That was the moment. And so, what does freedom mean? What did enslaved people do with this? And I think the reoccurrence of Juneteenth in contravention to the 4th of July is a moment for us to think about what freedom actually means. If you look at the self-congratulatory documents or the proclamation, freedom comes from these grand ideas enshrined on pieces of paper that a group of elite writers and thinkers and business people came together and wrote. But it's actually, in my opinion, how people struggle over that and how people make those ideas a lived reality. And that's where I see the opportunity for us to have truth-telling over time, because freedom changes over time. And I'll close with this thought. I don't know if any of you all think of yourselves as woke. I've been woke, okay? That's a given. I'm certainly not asleep, if that's what you want to be. But look at the vilification of the idea of being conscious. Oh, you one of these woke. Wait, when was that a bad thing? Malcolm X said, wake up, clean up, and stand up, right? Why is that a problem? But if we think about it, it's consistent, and the history of Juneteenth will take us. Because in the early 1910s, when the United States wanted to project itself as a global power in the First World War, Juneteenth was seen as subversive. That was the word then, subversive. Bodies of thought that outside of the celebration of American virtue. As you get into the Cold War period, these things are unpatriotic. That was the actual word used for the celebration of Juneteenth. From many corners, there are those also in the current moment, you will be surprised, who will call things like Juneteenth divisive. You see, you're dividing us. What are we dividing? Are we dividing or expanding what freedom means? And so, as we think about this current moment where truth-telling is something that has been vilified in the political sphere, let's think about Juneteenth and the pull force that it represents in terms of thinking about what freedom means.
All right, thank you so much. That's a wonderful way to kind of segue to where I want to pick up, and that is in the profession as historians, we have certain terms and phrases and things that we use as sort of ways to organize and think about the past and to think about how people have participated in the world and shaped the world. And given the discussion that was had now about the Civil War and about Juneteenth, ways in which it kind of a way to struggle and think about how we conceptualize and talk about freedom, We often talk about agency in our space. We also talk about self-determination, right? And I'm wondering if you all could sort of talk about those sort of two concepts and how critical and how important they are, not only historically, but even today as we begin to think about contemporary social movements like Black Lives Matter and other kinds of initiatives that have sought to grapple with the absurdity and the challenges that we face.
He just said, Professor Wilson, go ahead. Let me catch up to the question. Um, Agency. Agency is this word that scholars of slavery, they love to use it when talking about historical subjects. They like to say, oh, and let's give the slave agency. Let's render agency to the enslaved. The slaves or the enslaved do not need anyone else to render them agency, right? When we're writing, people like to say, make them active. What do you mean make them active? They're burning down a barn. They're running away, right? So this word about agency, particularly as it looks at slavery, is really problematic to me. I like the old school word called day-to-day resistance. Just day-to-day resistance or rebellion or, revolt. I teach a class on comparative slave rebellions, and we start with the definition of revolution and revolutionary, right? And I make them put it into the readings, and the students don't have anything to kind of hang their hat on until I make them go to the dictionary. And of course, the revolution is American revolutionaries. It's upending a process, right? Where the problem is they have a hard time understanding that as it relates to the enslaved life and agency. Enslaved people daily were trying to upend the process. Now, sure, there were people who, for various reasons, were afraid. This is one of the most gruesome forms of torture ever in human history. So there are people that might not be seen to be proactive about their enslavement. My argument is just surviving was revolutionary when you think about everything that enslaved people were up against. So agency in this present moment. I am going to be a little controversial and weave in my next book project, which is on Black women's bodily autonomy. So we know from the moment that shackles were first put on them that African women, and particularly African women's bodies, were not their own, right? We know they were raped on the slave ship. Sometimes some would enter the slave ship and be pregnant and find a way to induce abortion, even on the slave ship. So there's always this search for Black women bodily autonomy. And we see it after the Civil War. They use the courts, the same courts that actually was legislating slavery. They go back to these federal courts. They go back to these courts established by the Freedmen's Bureau, and they enter petitions saying that I'm working for this white man for wages, but he won't leave me alone. But they also submit petitions. I got back together with Randy, who I used to be with on this plantation, and I want to curse, and he's beating my ass. And so these same women that are held by these laws are now seeking the state to protect them. And I think that's also part of freedom, because the conversation about freedom and agency is what it is and what it isn't, and who the law protects. Fast forward all the way to last summer when all women lost rights to bodily autonomy. And in some ways, that's where I'm thinking about agency and the kind of work that people now have to do just to protect their own type of, whether or not they bring a child into this particular world. And then what was the other word? That was just agency. What was the last word? Oh, Black people have always been implicit in self-determination. There wouldn't be pyramids, there wouldn't be civilizations, there wouldn't be, again, I go back to the legal record. When in doubt, go to the legal record. But I also think it's very important in terms of self-determination, but whether it's a political struggle, whether it's, something that you're writing, that your students, so you might be researching. I think the most important thing to think about self-determination is Black self-determination and Black success often comes with a heavy level of pain, right? We think of, in this moment of Black Lives Matter, I still think there were no moments of Black Lives Matter because Black children and Black people are being hunted and haunted with these images of police brutality. where was I going with this? I was going somewhere. I wasn't as smooth as Brother Brown making the transition. Hold on. Haunted, Black Lives Matter, self-determination. Self-determination comes also at a cost, but it is only understanding how Black people suffered and endured that you can also understand not just Black self-determination, but how joy is also a form of Black self-determination. You know, Black people aren't always angry. 9 times out of 10, they're not always angry. It is not what I'm preaching to the choir. It's not what you see on TV, and that's also the truth telling.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you were to go to a 4th of July barbecue, some places, a lot of us would be looked at funny. But if everyone in this room came to a Juneteenth celebration, guess what? It'll be very welcome. And that's another truth telling that people don't understand, right? When it comes to people of color in general, we're actually more welcoming in some spaces than than society has ever been to us. So, with that, I will pass.
All right, Brother Brown, go ahead.
Very, very powerful question. I've had to use the word agency more in just thinking about how we look at the narrative of people's journeys. So if I were to say 20th century African American history, Black folks endured Jim Crow, then we won civil rights, and then we had, we migrated to the North. A lot of those brackets don't really capture the imagination and creative work that everyday people bring to the table. So if you were to ask somebody who's living in the midst of Jim Crow, their bracket for when they measure success, when they measure accomplishment, might not line up with the official calendar. So that's where I get into agency more as an analytical tool. How do I find ways to capture the voices of people? For instance, just a little bit about my own work. I could write a story about funk bands, but having the opportunity to interview a lead singer guitarist named Sugarfoot. Do y'all know who Sugarfoot is? Ohio player, Skin Tight, Fire, Roller Coaster. All right, I want to be what? Free? I want to be free. That's a man named Sugarfoot from Hamilton, Ohio. So if you want to get into the contours of freedom, I can look at the lyric. I can take the latest theory on music, but the agency of the project that I'm interested in leads me to want to hear what he has to say about what he felt. And just to give you an example, I asked him, because he's the person responsible in popular music. You've all probably heard this. Somebody in the song says, ow. Right? You familiar with that? Ow. So I came over there, I studied all kinds. I met with him at his house, and I said, what is the ow? Where'd that come from? I'm expecting him to tell me, came up to Mississippi and give me this big, long story. He said, that's just what I say when I see a fine lady. Ow, girl. So, again, what we're looking for is the voice, because whatever he's feeling, he's inspired. There's a sonic inspiration that means other things when we consume it. So that's really an example of me running into agency even when I thought it was not really important in the process. One thing about agency is that it will take agency and slap you upside the head if you think you know the answers before you do the research. Self-determination, I think, falls into the other aspect of the freedom struggle, and that is, what do we imagine as the alternative? Who are we? We know that we're in resistance. We know that we are trying to grapple with the constraints on, but somewhere in that process, you have to think of a world that's different. Like Professor Milward said that, enslavement did not have to happen. And thinking about the possibilities, what's the vision for the future? That's really what is an engine for a lot of resistance. A lot of people who think outside of the box, or who say, you know what, we don't have to do it that way. They're driven by something. Sometimes it's spiritual. Sometimes it's a deep felt creative imagination. So I think that self-determination also points us to, and I'll end here, this remark. I agree with a music label owner named Dick Griffey who owns Solar Records. Y'all heard of the Whispers? You heard of Midnight Star? You heard of Shalimar? All right. You heard of Babyface? He was with a group called The Deal on Solar Records. And Climax, all meeting in the ladies' room. All right. That's Climax. That's a record label in Los Angeles. It was the Motown of LA, actually, the Motown of the 80s, called Solar Records, Sound of Los Angeles Records. Now, he was fond of saying that the kind of contracts in the music industry and in other arts industries were akin to enslavement or akin to colonizing a country and taking hold of its resources. He said for African people, music and the arts, that's black folks' oil. Just like the oil on the continent or the minerals that make everybody else wealthy and live a higher quality of life, the people who actually are there don't benefit. And you think about the arts in relationship to African struggle, that's the domain where we've had the space to really talk about truths in ways that imbue the spirit of Juneteenth. So it's Bob Marley that says, you know, old pirates, yes, they rob I, you know. So but if you say that in the midst of a curriculum in certain states, you are bringing in a divisive, woke ideology. But that didn't stop Bob Marley. That didn't stop Ella Fitzgerald. Just the notes that she would do with her voice alone create a canvas of possibility. So that's where I see the power of self-determination. How do we get on the mothership? How do we get the mothership? When is it coming? It's in the sphere of that creative space that's not solely consumed by what we're fighting against, but also thinking about the world we want to build.
Wow, that's powerful. You know, it's interesting. We are here at Pasadena City College. Of course, we know one of the great alum of Pasadena City College, of course, is none other than Octavia Butler. And I think that Octavia Butler's work needs to be mandatory for all PCC students. Next time I walk into my class and I ask them who Octavia Butler is, and they look at me like I had never heard of that before, that's our responsibility, right? And if you were to read any of her texts, if you take one of her classic texts, Parable of the Sower, which is actually set in this year that we're in, it's actually set in the 2020s. And it was written in 1993, and much of what you see and hear and engaging in that book, what she's grappling with in terms of the dystopian reality that we face, is very present with us today, all right? But again, Butler is part of a tradition and part of a community of people who are attempting to imagine a different kind of world, right? And I think that that's also important as we think about freedom, about what are we, not just freedom from things, but what are we trying to imagine? What are we trying to create? How do we nurture, right, our creativity and our imaginative sensibilities so that we can think critically and outside the box, so we can think in expansive ways, right? So that we can learn how to apply things like a growth mindset where we're not afraid to fail, right? And that failure is something that we invite, something that we actually engage in on a regular basis. We fail fast, we fail quick, and then we learn from that and work to do other things. So as we think about kind of contemporary social movements, one of the beautiful things we see today among young people is that they are raising really critical questions around abolition, questions around policing, questions around defunding, right? These are challenging, awkward, disruptive questions, right? But they're grounded in this dystopian reality that we find ourselves in. I mean, to wake up. Now, what I want to do is then pivot on that and think about the documentary that some of you all were able to watch. And one of the things I was struck by is Brother Robinson's sort of his journey, right? His journey to deeper political consciousness. The great Elaine Brown former leader of the Black Panther Party, once said that revolutionaries don't come out of the womb with a raised fist. All right, the idea that political consciousness is something that is shaped over time, right, through experience. And so what we see with Mr. Robinson is that he's taken us on a journey. All right, he's a very educated person. He went to Marquette University, got a law degree from Harvard, but he's been a journalist, he's been engaged, but at the same time, he's like, I'm learning new things within the context of the moment that we live in, right? I'm being forced to return back to the history books to try to make sense of a reality that's just out of place. I can't figure it out. And he's being vulnerable by taking us back to his hometown of Memphis and sort of taking us through his childhood and bringing some of his childhood best friends and demonstrating both his humanity and connection to people you might not think he would have been connected to in Memphis in the 1960s, right? So he takes us through a process. So I want you guys to talk about that process of political consciousness that's important. But I also want to ask you, one of the things that I was also struck by is the importance of Black women in terms of holding space for the community. If you saw, there was a kind of thread there, right? Eric Garner's mother, Mamie Teal's mother, right? All of these Black women who have lost sons. I can't remember his first name, Brother Payne in Memphis, right? Who was shot and killed. I mean, put a shotgun right into this young man's chest and blew him away right there, right? I wasn't even aware of that. I'm a historian. I didn't know about that situation in Memphis. That was a revelation for me, right? And so what I want to ask you all is to kind of talk about political process, consciousness, and awareness, as well as sort of thinking about the centrality of African-American women in terms of the role they play in making sure that the names are remembered, the landmarks are created, that the statues are taken down, et cetera. Either one of y'all.
Oh, no, I'm nervous. I'm nervous. I was going to go somewhere completely left of where your question was. Just to say this, that one of the things, so my colleagues on either side, and so many of you, I'm sure, really enjoyed the documentary and got a lot out of it. It's a good thing I didn't have a piece of paper and a notepad, because there were a lot of things that I thought needed to be explored more. So I'm going to say this in a few different parts. Okay, great. I'm going to say this in a few different parts, and it doesn't answer anything you asked, but I've been on task mostly, which is pretty good for me. The first is I often go to visit a gentleman by the name of Mumia Abu Jamal, who's incarcerated in Pennsylvania for he's incarcerated for killing a police officer. His case about whether or not he is actually guilty has been going on for decades. He's was on death row, and then within the last 10 years, 10 or 12 years, he's moved to life in prison. And so I have a friend that's an organizer who's very involved with his campaign, and I finally said, well, thank you, Johanna Fernandez, who's very active in the Free Mumia campaign. And she said, I'm going to have you go meet Mumia. I said, sure. I have nothing to talk about. I don't do the 20th century. I don't do political moments. She said, no, I want you to be a light. And this goes back to imagining a better future. She said, you're funny, you're this. I want you to be a light. I can be a light for Mumia Abu Jamal. And so when we met each other, it was just me alone. And he came to me, they released him. There was a common room because he's now, life in prison. And we could touch each other. And so he bent for a hug, but I could tell he was trembling. And so much later, I said, so what is it like? He had just been in General Pop for a few months. I said, what is this like? He said, terrifying. He said, all the times that I was in my cell and in solitary and on death row, I knew this moment would hopefully come, but now I'm terrified. It takes me a minute to just adjust to being around people. So I think also when we're looking at kind of and I'll also say, the most positive person you will ever meet in this world, the most positive person I have ever met, is like literally in the belly of the beast. So I think I would like to have seen more on the documentary about those who are incarcerated and whose freedoms have been stripped, this, I think the documentary, the 13, I also have comments about that, but I think that does a great job. So that was one of the things I felt that was missing from the show, from the documentary. The other thing I want us to think about in terms of, because you said Confederacy and Black women and the woman who helped to bring down the Nathan Bedford statue. So can I just do because of Black woman, I'm going to make you think about this, and that'll answer your question. So when there was the component where he was talking about that Washington Monument, and he was defending why you wouldn't take the Washington Monument down. Okay, all valid points. But George Washington was a slaveholder. George Washington, he used the teeth of his formerly enslaved people in his own mouth. So he's literally consuming Blackness in a way that we would think, he literally stood on the shoulders of enslaved people. So I also think when we think about freedom and what stories it's appropriate to tell and truth-telling, that even some people are invested in this big meta-narrative of freedom and democracy. In terms of Black women, we've always been the truth-tellers. The enslaved population was reproduced through our womb. No one else could. But just like slavery was embedded in Black women's womb, so was freedom, because there comes a moment, particularly in states like Maryland and Virginia, where slaveholders are realizing it's not profitable to hold slaves long term, so they start entering into agreements where women and at some point their children can also be freed from slavery at a certain point. In order to negotiate that and to get that to happen, these had to be very cunning women, right? Cunning women. We know disproportionately women who were manumitted, that means being freed by the hand, freed before emancipation. We know disproportionately women were freed more so than men, and it was after the childbearing year. And they were freed for many reasons, but often they took at least one child with them. And it was ruled that if you were freed, you had to be able to get this. If you were free, you had to be able to provide a sufficient life for yourself. If you were enslaved and helped build all this capital, in order to be free, you had to make sure that you were sufficient enough that you would not be on the county docket, because that was usually reserved for landless white planters. So Black women come into freedom even before Reconstruction, with this sense that there's so many things I want to say, with this sense of responsibility and this sense of, the family might be shattered. I didn't say that they came into freedom with their husband or their partner. It was written into law at a very early moment. The Black men were written out of the home. And that impacts Black women as well. So despite all odds, I'm going somewhere with this. I think the narratives the Black women tell, be it about narratives of our own body, our own history, or the narratives that we watch in terms of watching children, right? I'm not a mother, but I'm now a mother de facto. My partner has children in Ghana, and he wants to bring them to the U.S. Ooh, I said, I don't know. I know plenty of people. I know this is such a first world problem. Plenty of people raise Black children in the U.S., but I said, I don't know. I think they're fine. I think they're healthy in this, environment, this Black environment. Let's keep them here. But there's this notion that democracy is always better in the United States. So that did not answer your question. It was just my hodgepodge of thought. Thank you very much.
No, it's a phenomenal and something that I've been thinking about as well. Particularly the way that Black women's experience. This is why Black women's study is worthy of its own, because that journey intersects all aspects of class, with gender discrimination, and then also the amount of women that haven't been that have been involved in leadership, but leadership is not just the person that's the most visible. And so even in my own work, I can move even from funk. I know we got a lot of funk fans in here. Y'all don't want to admit it, but I know we got some undercover funketeers in here, right? And if you look at the albums, Earth, Wind, and Fire, You look at groups like Slave, you look at Lakeside, you look at the group Zap, you'll notice most of the members of the bands are men. They may have a woman vocal, but that does not mean that women were not leaders in that movement. What do I mean by that? If you're trying to get into the community, that phenomenon of funk music local level, you're dealing with women who are managers. Most of the moms are the managers. They're the ones that get the group over to practice. They're the ones talking to other parents. You know, Samantha's going to be all right with us because I'm here. There was a manager named Angel, Margaret Harris, who I'm writing about in my book. And one of the most important roles that she played was actually securing parental agreement with young people staying out late hours in nightclubs. So all of that is not going to be on the canvas of the album. And so I found that this is a great metaphor in many respects for the ways that we still have to struggle to redefine what leadership really is in order to capture and democratize that whole concept. So there's a lot of stories like that I've run into from my own work that I think support this idea that we have a long way to go when it comes to telling the story in ways that's far more inclusive. The other point I want to make is back to the process of consciousness and back to the documentary. I was really entertained by what I felt was the naivete of the protagonist. And the scene I like was when he's talking with the person about the Confederate flag, and then he gets nauseous. He just can't handle it. The guy says something. He says, I'm not feeling right now. I think I better excuse myself. And then he's looking, rolling his eyes as he walks away. That, to me, is an unfortunate kind of exchange of words where some might say, well, that's great. They're having dialogue. That's not dialogue. That's not discussion. And so many times I hear us almost fetishize this idea. We need to have a new conversation. We need to have a new dialogue. But you can have dialogue or just two monologues passing by like two ships in the night. And so that's what I was feeling. And then I said to myself, well, what's missing there? And I come up with these phrases, come up with this stuff. They go nowhere, but I think I got something cool. My mother's first language was sign language because both of my grandparents on her side were deaf. And my aunt actually was a deaf interpreter. She was with the group Sweet Honey on the Rock for many years. And she would have to interpret sound for deaf people. And how do you do that? How do you use your body to get someone to feel the experience of rain, the sound of rain hitting the ground? That's a creative enterprise. And conversation is also a creative enterprise. So I have this thing now. I'm not doing sign language. I think I'm trying to do mind language. So in other words, I have to listen to, I'm striving for this, y'all. Don't hold me accountable. This is a goal. How to listen for what people are really trying to say. Because sometimes the words and the vocabulary are shaped by trying to be right, being in battle. But there's something else there in many cases. As I watch different media outlets and these new conversations about race, conversations about freedom, most of the time people are talking past each other. And so I said, wow, there needs to be a real discussion about listening. Dr. Wilkins has always talked about active listening. And some of that requires a suppression of your reaction. See, because that remark that really made the person upset, the brother upset, I don't think he understood what the person is really saying. Now, we can actually get to the core or we can be offended all the time. If you want to get to the core, the way I felt it is that person with the Confederate flag, a lot of his sense of self, sense of being, sense of community, sense of value is tied to the legacy of Confederate nationalism. Right or wrong or indifferent. And so if you're going to have a dialogue with somebody from that standpoint, you have to kind of go into it knowing that you're not going to be able to pull the carpet from somebody's and expect them to just stand in place. It's going to be a much longer kind of conversation that's going to take some empathy, even with people. This is the Dr. King concept. Even with people that we don't agree, and I think it's not just black, white, people of color, white. In the black liberation struggle, we have to practice that internal to the community. Am I right? We will go a long way with some of these practices, just with one another, across generational lines. With me, across music style lines. Wasn't for Fanon, I don't think I would have given hip hop a chance. But hey, all that cursing and all that N-word, and come on now, I can't. But he'll say, well, what do they mean when they say it, as opposed to me being offended? So on that note, in terms of processes of consciousness, I think understanding intent, understanding the power dynamic, and understanding the power to define. So if you're going to call me CRT, then I'm going to call you IRD, institutional racist deniers. Denialism, like the kind of denialism of great atrocities that have happened elsewhere. We have it right here. And something about racism being an institution bothers people. But it's the truth, as I see it. And until there's evidence to move us otherwise, I think we should stand on that truth. And we should also put a negative value to those who deny the truth, because I believe that truth is at the core of what freedom is all about.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brown. As you can probably tell, we could do this and continue to speak and talk and riff on these various subjects into infinitum, but I want to open it up to you all to pose questions, queries, concerns, criticisms, whatever you feel like, because this is an opportunity for us to have an exchange. Yes. Oh, hold on. All right, there's obviously some kind of collusion here. Because you obviously put her in the audience. And this is what you call a setup question. You just asked this man if he's ever done any research on Prince. Okay, see, that's what you do. There's something in basketball called an alley-oop. Right? When you throw an alley-oop, that's what? That's an easy point. All right? But anyway, I say that to say, absolutely, you're talking to one of the great experts on Prince right here. And so, all right, well, that's good. That's good. I like when real Prince heads step up. So go ahead, Scott. Go ahead and follow us.
You got two choices if you want to have a battle in history. You can write about the Black Panther Party, or you can write about Prince. It's going to be no joke. And it is no joke, and you're absolutely right about how important he is. The problem with understanding and having a discussion about Prince is the problem of the purple rain effect. So the city of Minneapolis has a relatively small black population. However, it's a very cohesive population, and they actually had the National Guard come around 1967, 68 because of an uprising around an incident of police brutality. And so we don't think of, so there were jokes made by people like Chris Rock. You know, there are two black people in Minneapolis. One's an athlete and the other is Prince. Nothing could be further from the truth. That was a hub of jazz. It was a hub of music. It's a hub of, it's North Minneapolis is a black area. And so it changes the way we also think about where black culture comes from. We typically think about the big cities on the coast, and we think that the size of the community is what generates it. Now, part of the Purple Rain effect was also the disappearance of black community in Purple Rain. So you think that Prince is racially ambiguous. If you watch that film, he's not. His parents, both from Louisiana. They migrated to Minneapolis. His father's a jazz musician and his mentor. So he's a prodigy of a family of artists, and he's the prodigy of community. And this is where I want to get into this idea, not just of individual genius, but of community genius. Prince was able to take music lessons for free at a cultural center called The Way. It was a black cultural center, and led by a brother named Mahmoud Ahati. They used the 7 principles, Kuji Chagalia, Umoja Kuji Chagalia, the 7 principles that are around Kwanzaa. And Prince, now let me show you what's so ironic. Minneapolis is so segregated that the nightclub that was supposed to be the place where Prince performed and had this battle with Morris Day in the time and Apollonia, black bands in Minneapolis could not play at that club. Alexander O'Neal, Prince, members of the group The Flight Time, they would have to rent hotels and have banquets in order to play live. So the cultivation of Prince as a genius is also fostered by that community and his sense of self-determination. He admitted that he made some choices in his career. I mean, he was a teenager. And a lot of what his deal with Warner Brothers was the kind of thing that he would protest against in the 90s. That is, even the extent of owning his name. That's his real name, Prince Nelson Rogers. That's his real name, Rogers Nelson Rogers. Now, the record label owned his name. That's why I remember he had that sign. He said, "Don't call me by my name." It was the artist formerly known as. So, but those contracts, but part of what made Prince famous was the way the industry was looking for a deracialized artist. And Prince didn't fully go along with it. If you listen to even the early For You, the self-titled album, Dirty Mind, Controversy, 1999, there's always a continuum on the funk and political commentary going. So you can see that struggle he had to go through. By the time he's tired of Warner Brothers, he'd already done a lot of major innovation with using the internet to sell records, which is now, the norm. Album Crystal Ball. He said he made more money off of that album off the internet than he did on Purple Rain. He also wrote the word, what? We talking about Juneteenth? He wrote the word slave on his face. People thought that was, how are you gonna be so rich and be a slave? Because he's talking about the proportionality of that wealth that I talked about earlier, that black oil, that art that fuels the world, and looking at the profits it generates and the unequal balance with respect to what artist receives. And so that struggle is ongoing. I think that he's inspired a whole generation of people that think like that. But I can go on and on about Prince and about Minneapolis, but I think that it teaches us a good lesson if we assume the counterfactual. Let's just say that Prince never gets the record deal with Warner Brothers. Would he be any less of a genius? If he didn't get the record deal and he stayed in his community, let's say he was a music teacher, let's say he was a mentor, would that be any less valuable? What's the logical conclusion? We have Princes, we have Billie Holidays, we have Stanley Clarks, we have genius around us. And what stardom does is shine a light on what is present and available wherever community exists. That's community genius.
And I'm going to highlight Dr. Brown's work. I was fortunate to spend some time in Dayton, Ohio, about a decade ago, doing some photography for him for this book project he's been working on. But one of the things that's really wonderful about the work is how grounded it is in community, particularly in the role of Black marching bands. Sort of, if you notice the Earth, Wind, and Fires and groups of that nature, you notice they always have really expansive horn sections. And if you think about sort of Black marching bands and Black high schools in the Midwest, one of the things he does is really amplify and underscore how many of the folks who would find themselves in these bands, they were nurtured in these Black high school spaces by Black teachers, music instructors, who would then, be foundational to them evolving and becoming kind of musicians. And the musicianship that we see on full display grows out of these community spaces, right? And so that's a whole nother layer, but I just wanted to amplify and underscore that. All right. Any other questions?
There was a bunch of hands.
There's another hand up.
There was a bunch of
Oh, there we go. Go ahead. The tipping point. Yes. Well, let me just say something about that tipping point. I think the tipping point actually, he kind of uses this sort of, the Sisyphus mythology. I don't know if you guys remember in Greek mythology, Sisyphus is sort of condemned by is it Zeus or the sort of God to actually have to be basically forced to push this boulder up a hill. And he pushes the boulder up the hill, but every time the boulder gets to the top, it falls back down on him. But the thing is that he pushes into eternity. He never stops. He continues to push and he continues to push. But the point being is that I think that what brought to mind, and that's part of why I opened this conversation up with this question of history and not thinking about history linearly and not thinking about history always representing progress. One of my students today in class, in my history course that meets between 9:45 and 11:50 Tuesday and Thursday, said to me today, he said, yes, history is like being in a pinball machine. Because, when the ball goes and hits different things, it goes in different directions, right? The great Greg Tate, one of our great cultural critics that we lost a year or so ago, often talked about the importance, both Greg Tate and Arthur Jaffa, another major creative today, talk about just the multidimensionality of life, right? Things unfold in a variety of ways at the same time. And part of our challenge is how do we grapple with and negotiate 2 or 3 things being true at the same time? Right? And that was one of the things I think that Jeffrey Robinson tried to raise. And I think that when we began to provide a new kind of frame for history, when we begin to think about it in different kinds of ways, it frees us up to make sense of and to come across, new ways of thinking that can then sort of lead to more imaginative and creative sort of ways of figuring out how to go forward. So this is why we need the Octavia Butlers. This is why we need the Toni Morrison. This is why we need the Paul Laurence Dunbar. This is why we need the historians, the sociologists, the engineers, right? We need all of these. All of this is part of how we sort of think through and grapple with really tough issues, right? When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, when it comes to how do we deal with equity, how do we fly the plane as we build it, right? A lot of that, how do we improvise on the fly, right? How do we freestyle, right? All of that, we can see how it's practiced in various places, and we could mine it for its power, but if we don't really see its value, like hip hop or other kinds of things, and we see it in a kind of one-dimensional way, we miss the boat in terms of what it can potentially offer us, creative, imaginative. That's really where we are. We're in a crisis in that space. Everybody's all worried about ChatGPT, right? We're all in this space where artificial intelligence is in front of us, right? And we're trying to figure out how do we negotiate and how do we deal with it. Well, I think it's nurturing the things that we know that makes us human beings. That's the way forward. The the compassion, right? That's the stuff that still, Peter can't, it ain't there yet. I just say it may not get there, but we have to still lean in on the things that we control and that we can really deep. That would be my response to that. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a question? What did you think the tipping point was for you at that time? How did you feel about it? Just, because we have all these different, ways of thinking about it.
And again, yes, we are going backwards instead of going forward. But historically, we've gone backwards and gone forward, right? But if we don't recognize that, then it all looks like something brand new. And unfortunately, it's not. That's part of the challenge. And so if the narratives and if the history is sanitized and if people are afraid of the truth, critical race theory becomes a political football when we just, Dr. Milward just basically explained to you how things came into law, right? And it was always things come into law through intersectional ways. Race, class, gender, all these things impact the ways in which laws are shaped. It's not anything deep and heavy and, oh my God, it's actually just the reality. There's not political neutrality, right? That there's things that this is how legal statutes come into existence. But instead, we get presented as if, wokeness and all this stuff. And by the way, wokeness, I don't know if you all know, but when we talk about the contemporary mainstream approach to wokeness, even the concept woke, not only came from or was put forth by Erykah Badu in her amazing album, the fourth, I can't remember the name of the full album, but it was written by none other than Georgia Ann Muldrow, who's also a phenomenal underground artist here who co-wrote that song. And so when she says, when she talks about being master teachers and I stay woke, that was where that formulation kind of came from. So wokeness, people talk about different genealogies, but in the contemporary sense, that's where I always locate. So that's another kind of piece of the puzzle. All right, anyone else have anything there?
I think now I have an answer to your question. I had to think it over. It's okay to sometimes think of answers to questions. I think the tipping point, I think the tipping point for Black people has been during several phases, right? And that's just the history. That's the history of African Americans. Some groups have a particular kind of history. I think in this country, it's been about gaining rights and then having those rights retracted. Gaining rights and having those rights retracted. When we think about Juneteenth, and we think about the tradition, one of the traditions that people have during Juneteenth isn't just the food, but certainly those first generations of people that celebrated Juneteenth, is they would say the name of their ancestors who had been enslaved. And when you think about still this notion of going uphill and coming back, going uphill and coming backward, that is still further than previous generations anticipated and dreamed. I absolutely think that in some ways that quote, "We are our ancestors' wildest dreams," not to be too Pollyanna, but I think that is very accurate for certain things, right? So I think it is just endemic to certain movements in history. We are always going to be pushing that hill in America. I think the tipping point came, the moment of possibility came unfortunately, the death of so many people, and then George Floyd, right? Because everyone looks at the George Floyd moment. There continues to be a line of people that are killed by hate groups, by the power structure, however you want to define it. But the point of the matter is that was the moment, the tipping point is when allies said, "Oh, this is what you've dealt with? I am so sorry. Is there something we can do?" And that was a great moment because it took some of the responsibility off of us to do the work of race. But now we're already backsliding on that. So that, again, wokeness is a bad term. Black Lives Matter is now a bad term, right? And so if we think about, and unfortunately its responsibility is on us, if we think about the spirit of the ancestors and we think about the nature of Juneteenth to honor those struggles before us, the reality is we just have to keep pushing. I mean, because our tipping point has happened so many times, and it's not the same. I think that various points of history can be true at the same time.
Yeah, it's like a simultaneous thing. And I'm sorry to have to keep, being a propagandist for the funk. So you can dance underwater and not get wet. With the rhythm it takes to dance through what we have to live through, you can dance underwater and not get wet. And that's really about space, but it's also about what Sun Ra was saying too, that's jazz artist, prophetic philosopher. Sometimes it's like the Sankofa concept of moving forward and backward in the same instant. Like in this moment, even with all of these reactionary politics, look at the way that we can communicate with one another now. So there's some positive things in the moment, and there's some problematic ones. We've always had to negotiate both at the same time. So that's where I think what Dr. Wilkins was saying at the very beginning, you might have to even throw out the word progress and have a more complicated language for talking about our experience.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, we are pretty much out of time, but I want to thank everyone for your presence. I want to encourage folks to please get some more food on your way out. And I want to thank Dr. Carrie Boland for helping put this together. Let's give her a round. And I'm gonna turn it over to her.
Thank you. Another round of applause for Dr. Brown, Dr. Millward, Dr. Wilkins. Greatly appreciate your expertise, your time, your personal sacrifice. This is labor that's involved in you all sort of consuming that content and knowledge, not just for your own individual deepening of understanding, but for community understanding. So thank you so much for that. Juneteenth is Poetry is an event that's taking place 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. in the amphitheater, hosted by TABE and Build Women. So join us over there for that time. We'd love to see you back in the Circadian tomorrow, 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. We're going to be hosting Donzale Abernathy, Reverend Dr. Ralph Abernathy's youngest daughter, to talk about activism and really who the feet were behind Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy's dream around the civil rights movement. So join us there tomorrow. Food will be provided. We appreciate y'all. Have a blessed rest of the day. Thank you.